everyone, it's Stacy. I'm going to be talking about Dr. Lee Kern today for my Behaviorist Biography project. Who is Dr. Lee Kern? Dr. Kern is currently a professor at Lehigh University's Special Education Program in Pennsylvania, where she is also the director of the Center for Promoting Research to Practice. Her research interests include positive behavior supports, obviously special education, behavior disorders, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Currently, she has two funded research projects. The first one is called Advancing Tier 2 Adaptations and Interventions, or ATTAIN. When talking about Tier 2 interventions, she's referring to this secondary level I've noted here on this graphic. In the primary prevention level, that's the level of interventions that reach the majority, or about 80% of students. Secondary prevention is the level of interventions that reach about 15% of students. So this is more in your special education and your special education with difficult behavioral issues. Then the tertiary prevention is the top 5% of the most difficult to reach, with typical interventions when you need to adapt them more. So ATTAIN works to adapt interventions to Tier 2 students, which has been shown to be most effective when those interventions are personalized. The purpose of this program is to develop a guide for educators to help them learn how to choose and adapt interventions, and it is supported by the Institute of Education Sciences and the Department of Education. Her second project is the Pathway 360-Degree College and Career Readiness Program. This is for high school students who want to prepare for college or for a career. In this program, the students are able to fill out a career preference assessment and then are given course recommendations based on their top 3 career choices. It also includes bi-weekly advisory courses and field-based career exploration, and culminates in a presentation in their senior year about their level of readiness for college or career, and it is funded by the Department of Agriculture. For this project, I've chosen 5 of Dr. Kern's articles. I'm going to review them briefly here with you. The first is titled An Analysis of the Status and Stability of the Behaviors of Students with Emotional and Behavioral Difficulties. So in this paper, they found essentially that the performance of students with emotional and behavioral disorders were deteriorating throughout the year, meaning at time 1 they tested better than at time 2 later in the year. It also found that independent seat work and whole class instruction was occurring more often in these settings with these students than one-to-one instruction or small group instruction, which is what you would expect in a classroom with students with emotional and behavioral difficulties. It has been found that these lower scale levels of interventions and instruction are more useful than full group instruction. The second article was called Addressing the Needs of Students with Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Problems, Reflections and Visions. In this, Dr. Kern provides a review of the literature and highlights some areas in which she believes that our classrooms can be doing better for these students. Number 1, she talks about positive behavior supports and how they are needed in the classroom. Number 2, she focuses on teachers needing to maximize their relationships with students so that students feel supported and feel like they have someone to come to. And number 3, she talks about treatment fidelity, referring to whether or not interventions are being applied as they are intended to be. She argues that this needs to be re-examined because many interventions are likely not being applied as intended, and that's why they are not as effective as one would hope. Third, We have an evaluation of the functional behavioral assessment process used with students with or at risk for emotional and behavioral disorders. Essentially, this is a bit of a shorter article, but essentially it discusses whether or not the functional behavioral assessment can be used with these students and if it is applicable or reliable. Again, this was a literature search, and what she found, along with her co-researchers, was that the FBA can be used with these students. It is most successful when being used in an interviewing framework or a direct observation. No specific time frame was given for how long it would take, and it varied greatly depending on the type of means of gathering information, whether you're interviewing or giving direct observation. Also found that school staff can independently implement some aspects of the FBA, but they are in need of supports and trainings not only before they begin their service as a teacher, but while they are currently practicing as teachers in order to continue to support and train them in using the FBA. Next, I have the article entitled Further Examining the Triangle Tip, Improving Support for Students with Emotional and Behavioral Needs, referring back to the pyramid graphic I showed at the beginning of the presentation. This is the top 5% of students who require that tertiary level of intervention and support to reach them. In this, Dr. Kern and her associates line out several different ways in which the system is currently failing these students and how these facets of education can be improved. For example, on a school-wide level, positive behavior supports are being applied, but they are not actually reaching students on the individual level, which is a problem, and not exactly how positive behavior supports were intended, as they are intended to be person-centered. It also talks about educator attitudes and how educators are feeling a sense of helplessness and when dealing with students as though they don't know what to do, what's best for them. And this can be improved by, again, applying or creating more trainings for teachers, both pre and in service. The researchers also discussed the low level of engagement in classrooms, going back to the other article I talked about where there was a lot of independent seek work and whole class work, not one-on-one or small group engagement. This is a problem and should be addressed. And finally, arguing that the teachers are not adequately training in FBA. So while the previous article argued that they can do it, they're not actually being appropriately trained, and therefore they're creating inadequate behavior service plans. So while it is possible for these teachers to be implementing using the FBA and implementing behavior service plans, it is important that they are getting the appropriate training so that they're doing it correctly, and this goes back to treatment fidelity. Finally, I chose an article entitled A Comparison of Quality of Life Variables for Students with Emotional and Behavioral Disorders and Students Without Disabilities. This paper compared the responses of students with EBD on a quality of life questionnaire and students without to see if there were any major or significant differences. What they found unsurprising was that students with EBD reported lower quality of life levels, especially in self, relationships, and environment, which isn't surprising considering they often struggle to form social relationships or maintain them due to their problematic behaviors, rather. And it also argues that a person's well-being should be considered when designing treatment. So it shouldn't just be about fixing the problem behavior, but rather about helping that individual live a better life. And when we can focus on both and particularly a better life, we might be able to create more longer-lasting interventions for people with problem behaviors. In a mock interview, the questions I would want to ask Dr. Kern are, Have you ever considered expanding your research to see how interventions may have lasting effects into adulthood? I primarily work with adults, so this is very interesting to me, and I think that if we're applying interventions at a school level, we might be able to see some of these effects in adulthood. Can your current research be generalized to use these interventions with adults? So how different would it be to use interventions with adults? Have you discovered or developed any particular training or coursework to assist special education teachers in the classrooms working with students with EBD? And if so, have you seen any improvement in student stability after implementing such trainings? Several of the articles did comment on the fact that teachers need further training and coursework, so I'd be interested to know if Dr. Kern had tackled that issue herself at all. Besides the functional behavior assessment, have you considered the utility of other assessments with this population and whether or not they can be appropriately used? Going back to whether or not assessments have been appropriately normalized for this population, we use a lot of assessments in treatments and intervention planning to determine if things are working as we think they should, and if these assessments aren't appropriately measuring the target behavior because they aren't appropriate for this population, then that could be a huge problem. And finally, as a current trainee in positive behavior supports, what advice or recommendations could you give me for implementing PBS techniques with adults living with EBD and IDDD? So my population of clients that I work with primarily have emotional and behavioral disorders and intellectual or developmental disabilities, and I am currently training in positive behavior supports. I find it all very fascinating and interesting of combining ABA techniques with the person-centered practices, and I would like to know what Dr. Kern had to tell me as a up-and-coming behavior analyst and PBS facilitator. The implications of Dr. Kern's work suggest that special education students with EBD are falling through the cracks despite the fact that special education is improving in general for students. Her research provides us an opportunity to close this gap, and it inspires a person-centered approach with clients, going back to the positive behavior supports and the quality of life article. Also, interventions should not only be geared towards the client, but it should also work to train and assist the client's support system as they need it.